A very beautiful community. I'm sorry to have kept you. I was just struggling a little bit with my microphone and my oxygen. Let me know if you can see and hear me, and we'll start with a little bit of refresh of where we are in terms of the calamity that happened yesterday. And then we'll just sort of engage. Hello, beautiful Adam Raguzia. I've loved a few of your recent videos. And I watched a few old ones. I actually watched the Americanized and the traditional version of your ragu bolognese video. Amalfitano, thank you so much for running us. Okay, so my health is a bit crappy, so we're gonna hope that I make sense. And my main aim is more emotional to ground you, because I know some of you are freaking out. And also, if you have a slight divergence in how you see what happened yesterday from each other or from me, I just want to emphasize how welcome you are, right? This is not about sort of arguing things out. It's about just understanding that things are shaking because politics is transitioning into a new place, right? We're in the historical moment, and that's always a kind of radioactive, transfigurative situation. Things are changing and they feel a bit scary and a bit sickly and very uncertain and often outrageous because you're used to old things. You know, you go to the corner shop and you buy your usual 2 or 3 things there, and then they're not there, and the corner shop isn't there, and the street isn't there. So how am I meant to make sense of that reality? And what's the point of it all anyway? Why am I living here if that's the kind of unintelligible transformation that takes place? So I did a video yesterday that was my initial reaction. I'm going to just spend 2 or 3 minutes saying what some of my takeaways were, and then we'll talk. So it's very important that Trump's behavior stems from his need for narcissistic supply. It's not nice to point out that other human beings have a personality challenge, right? And that's obviously a negative personality challenge like neurodiversity, like narcissism, or if they have a benign situation like neurodiversity, like a lot of beautiful people have ADHD, it's often not nice to talk about that unless the people, themselves are open to discussing it. However, I feel this changes with political power, right? If you've got somebody running for leadership of a major power, and the way they operate is significantly inflected by their, quite poor management of their autism, for example, you've got to talk about it. And I know that's going to be controversial in the neurodiversity movement, but that's the reality. So with Trump, I do talk about ADHD allegedly, and I do talk about NPD. So bye, Adam. So, let's do this. So Trump has a need for narcissistic supply, and one of Zelensky's many tragedies is that Zelensky does not fulfill it at all. Trump is just not getting any grandiosity boosting whack of Zelensky at all. He got a lot from Macron and he got a lot from Starmer. It's not natural for Starmer to give it to Trump, but Starmer tried so hard and got there. But Zelensky can't do anything to change this because Trump is just set in his way. Matt is here having watched Anders's video. Anders did a walk around video with his reaction on his main channel, on his only channel. Other people are more intelligent; they just have one channel. Now, so that's very difficult because that means that Zelensky is just disregarded by Trump because Trump gets no juice of him. And as soon as they met yesterday, Zelensky was told by Trump, dressed up nicely today, are you? In a way that was foul and rude and condescending. Actually, it wasn't playful. So that's one real difficulty. He is just set on being dismissive of Zelensky. 2, Vance escalated the situation. This is not your view. This is my view. So Vance escalated the situation in a premeditated way for the MAGA audience and to please Trump. And Vance was completely in control when he did it. So it was an act of accomplished bullying. And Zelensky was ambushed. Now, what do I mean by ambush? Do I mean that there was some kind of meeting and they planned to do this? No. What I non-negotiably mean is that I was watching Vance, and as the whole situation escalated over 40 minutes, primarily through Zelensky being mean about Putin, which Trump hated, after all of that, Vance had a decision to make. Do I escalate this? And he didn't lose his cool like Zelensky did. He wasn't sort of semi-okay and semi-angry like Trump was. He was completely in control. And in a calculated way, he said, you know what? It's going to work here for me if I intervene and if I push this. So it was very, very intelligent politics. Very, very intelligent politics. I'm noticing a few super thanks I'm missing. And I do want to scroll right to the top just for a few minutes because I love looking at the questions that I initially left. So I'm going to jump to the comments momentarily. So I believe that it was premeditated in the sense that I saw Vance there for a few seconds thinking, will this serve me to blow this up a bit or not? And it was already heating up. And Vance decided to go for it. So that's what I mean by premeditated. Vance was sitting there and thinking, how will this look? And on the basis of the benefits derived from how it looks, should I do it? Yeah, I'm going to do it. That's what I mean by premeditated. I don't mean that there was some kind of committee meeting and they decided that they would go after Zelensky. So that's what I fundamentally mean by the ambush. Now, I'm going to make a third point briefly, which is the point that, let's guess, 50% of you don't like. So that's the point I bet we'll come back to in the comments and discussion. I said Zelensky arrived and looked flat. He wasn't ready to do what Starmer or Macron did. And when he got ambushed, he was petulant, combative, and unprepared. And here I sort of quoted Bill Clinton, one of his lines, whatever you think of Clinton, I'm not approving of his politics. I'm just saying that Clinton said that, high power politics is often eating a lot of shit and smiling at the same time, having that capacity. That was a very big test because Zelensky needed to go through his personal safety being at risk at the beginning of the war, to battling against an opponent that's fighting a war backed by at least a degree of genocidal rhetoric, massacres, huge transformation of Ukrainian society, losing parts of the country to apartheid-like occupation, and then a couple of clowns are telling you post-truths about what you're actually going through. And that's the kind of shit that Zelensky needed to either eat or not eat in that situation. It was a lot of shit. But the difference is that it might be impossible for an ordinary person to eat this shit, but Zelensky isn't an ordinary person. He's a person on whom the survival of a nation depends, on whose words and actions the survival of a nation depends. And now I'm saying most people in the pro-Ukrainian bubble don't like this point, but in 2025, I think we need to get real. So we're going to discuss that later because there are actually several theories here. And there is one theory which says that Zelensky himself deliberately fought back grumpily against Vance and Trump to disrupt the deal. We'll talk about that. So this is the controversial point in the community. So we'll do a bit of a community engagement around that because this is a very fraught time. Fourth, what we witnessed is just what it looks like for democracies to melt down and their foreign policies to melt down as a result, right? So it's that picture. There's this picture where Zelensky is like this, and Trump is like this, and Vance is like this, that captures foreign policy blown up by democratic decline. Democratic decline, foreign policy blow up. That's the causal direction there. 5. Article 5's credibility is irrevocably depleted. And what I think about that is that you can't recover what you've lost in Article 5 credibility, really. You can slow its demise. And of course, over the next quarter century, you could replace it with other security architecture. 6. Authoritarian populisms, and this is an ideological point, and it's risk sounding theoretical, but it's important. Authoritarian populisms circulating around the world share an ideological feature that I call hyperliberalism. And that's a situation where you've firstly got a magical primacy that's given to the market, with that then morphing into a primacy given to a kind of conflict of all against all, in which it is normalized that the mighty will win. So you get what you want by buying it, and if you can't buy it, you threaten, extort, or use force. And while they are very different in several respects, Putin's and Trump's ideologies, because Putin has many elements of fascism that Trump doesn't have, Trump has some, and because Putin has elements of mysticism that Trump basically lacks, this hyper neoliberalism story they share. And so, in this sense, all of this authoritarian wash that's swishing around the globe shares this very important ideological ingredient. And so, in this limited respect, but not in others, Trumpism is Putinism. 7, the point I make is that this is the last point, that this will be a huge test for European resolve and initiative and democratic capacity. And I think I say that it would be excellent but surprising if Europe met this test. And there's also a risk of Europe using, while saying sound words, using the opportunity of seeing the United States drop Ukraine to drop Ukraine too. Because fundamentally, Western Europe's commitment to Ukraine is not existential. Visceral observation, right? The level of kerfuffle you saw in the Oval Office is itself desacralizing. Just forget about the content, forget about the fact that Vance in particular was really unlovely in his behavior. He behaved like a shit at a crucial moment in international politics. Just that level of toxicity is itself desacralizing for democratic institutions. It itself normalizes a disregard for procedure, a disregard for history, a disregard for ritual, a disregard for tradition. So even if you are profoundly apolitical and you are cooking pancakes and arguing, with your spouse, but out of the corner of your eye, you're seeing a computer screen with that kind of kerfuffle going on, it delegitimizes politics. And we've talked about this effect in connection with January 6th, right? There's certain things you do that you can't undo. They just desacralize the space. That's part of the reason, for instance, why recently I was worried about the slight algorithmic influx of Trump-like bot comments in our community, because I like pro-Trump comments in principle if they're responsible, because I was worried that they would desacralize our space a bit, because when you get to when you're at a dose of 2 or 3% toxic comments, that's not an issue. But if they grow, if that dose grows, and there's a lot of people there with clown faces, calling you guys, you know, uh, leftist loons, um, it gets a bit toxic. But when you see 77 comments like that in a short, condensed exposure to a channel, just leaves a negative feeling. Um, so um, that's the desacralizing effect of that kerfuffle. Now, what we've um, got is a situation where Putin and Trump share this hyper neoliberal story that I've just briefly mentioned. They also share a desire to weaken the European Union. They also share support for authoritarian populism in Europe. And they also increasingly share a sphere of influence politics. Because one of the things that we began quite rightly to notice on the channels um, is that when Trump was threatening Panama and Canada, there was an equivalent to that, because that was saying, we've got a sphere of influence here, guys. And it's the American sphere of influence. But the equivalent to that is, don't other powers have spheres of influence too? And if they do, don't we need to respect them? And mightn't Ukraine be in Russia's sphere of influence? So there is quite a lot of both ideological and interest-based commitment overlap between the Kremlin and the White House. And that was, of course, itself, an important fabric that helped brew the special brew you witnessed yesterday. Let me now scroll briefly to the top. Um, and see if we've got questions. That were left there. If I can reach them, beautiful community. Okay, I'm struggling to scroll all the way up to the top. I think I saw early on a question about whether I agree with Malin Baker's assessment. I haven't watched it yet. Malin is a political analysis channel on this platform on YouTube, and a friend. So let me, in that case, comment on something I think may be implied by your question, which is, might it not be that Zelensky had some kind of plan coming into this? And the Russian commentator Vladimir Pastukhov speculated about this. He speculated that Zelensky may have planned to put Trump on the back foot by coming in, challenging him more than expected, simply to shake things up in a process that was going nowhere positive fast for Zelensky. And I don't agree with that. I think what actually happened is that Zelensky was of the view that the process was going nowhere fast for him. He was of the view also that he needed to be minimally transparent about the things he usually says. So he felt he wanted to say negative things about Putin. But that in the end, this was simply Zelensky reacting and losing control as a result of a profoundly difficult environment in which there was a history of post-truth claims being made about him, in which there's a history of the United States refusing to back Ukraine under Trump in various dimensions. um, and in which the conversation was progressing in an increasingly condescending way toward Zelensky. So I don't think there was anything of that kind premeditated there. Um, I nor do I think that the ambush was itself sort of long distance wise premeditated, but it was premeditated, if you like, on the spot. Vance really thought that this would be advantageous. And in a certain way, by the end, Trump did too. Trump is enormously self conscious about the um, PR benefits of public conflict. So he thought there was quite a lot that was very good about the way this developed. Okay, let's have a look at a few super thanks first. I was just wondering if you had seen Anders Bach-Nielsen's interpretation of the debacle. Yeah, I have, and I'm broadly sympathetic to it. I think it spends less time than I do pointing out how Zelensky could have handled this differently, but I'm broadly sympathetic. I think Anders tends to be more aspirationally optimistic than I am about the war and about Europe's capacity to act. I tend to be less aspirational in the way I talk about what Europe might do. Marley, thank you. Claudio, thank you. Mikhail, thank you. Matt, lots of love. JWH, Vlad, what's your opinion of Dominic de Villepin? His words were prophetic back in 2003 during the Iraq run-up. I don't know. Sorry. Um, you can throw back at me what the words were. Shadow Guy. As you know, I'm because of my illness, I'm often liable to have gaps. Greetings, Vlad from Bulgaria. What will yesterday's events affect? What will the effect be that they have on European efforts to become more capable of self-defense? Is it the same as before? So I think that there's certainly very considerable pressure for the Europeans to get their act together. But what we are at the moment witnessing is a lot of flowery rhetoric that I'm borderline uncomfortable with, because I'm thinking at the level of agency, who's going to do what and how to translate this into meaningful action. So I think that there's plenty that Europe can do in the medium term, but I am semi-skeptical and semi-agnostic, for reasons of not having expertise, about the capacity of Europe to generate a security guarantee in the form of troops on the ground in Ukraine. I'm open to that, but I start with a preponderance towards skepticism about this. So there is no question that Europe will do more, but the question is how much more, and will it be enough for us not to roughly lose the conflict with Putin and for Ukraine not to end up in a very difficult predicament. I would be skeptical more than optimistic about Europe's capacity to get its act together. And I also do worry, as I mentioned earlier, that some European powers will want to free ride, if you like, on America's withdrawal by saying, well, if America is withdrawing, we're going to withdraw too. One of the sort of forks in the road is how much the Europeans want to press and appeal to the Americans, or how much do they try to go about doing things themselves. So we're going to see. Europe will do more, but whether it can properly come up to the full extent of this security challenge, I'm pretty skeptical. Journalists are saying this is the end of the West. Are they correct, or is this irresponsible exaggeration? Well, look, in a sense, the West is a kind of cultural unit. It's not going to get destroyed just by security alliances melting down. So, no, it's not the end of the West. And we should also recognize that um, many of the greatest cultural products that the West produced weren't produced in politically pleasant times. And we should also recognize that even the recent history of much of the West is a history with a heavy leaning toward all kinds of unlovely authoritarianism. And in many ways, it's not un European to have a populist right that's succeeding everywhere. In many ways, it's an historical default for European politics. So, see, it depends what the West means. If by the West we mean sort of center left love affair the with convergence in the European Union, well, then yes, sure. NATO is melting down. The European Union is little by little melting down. All the trends are negative. Um, but what it means to talk about the end of the West, uh, you know, I in purely political terms, sure, the West is in crisis. But if it's a more comprehensive and cultural question, then no. The West is still um, utterly extraordinary culturally, and it's productive fecundity, production of cultural goods of various kinds. Um, and we are still the most democratic part of the world. So we're still doing well politically while trending in a bad direction. So um, I'm not going to complain too much about this idea of the end of the West because it's a nice headline and it probably does belong on some articles that make some good points. But basically, um, what we should say is that our domestic politics is trending negatively, and that means we cannot act effectively and collectively on the foreign policy stage. If you want to call that the end of the West, perhaps you can. Andre, thank you. Let's have a look. Hello, Vlad. First time I managed to catch you in line. Lovely to have you. I'm sure I don't need to tell you this, um, but don't overstretch your health for our sake. Take this as an expression of friendly care about you. That is so lovely and so beautiful. Thank you. David, thank you. The lighthouse in a foggy, stormy night. Thank you very much. Let's have a look where we are. Let's fish for a few questions, beautiful community. Vlad, do you think this will be enough for the EU to use the frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine? So the prospect of these assets being used is now much greater, but there's also very considerable reluctance of doing that because of the precedent it sets. But the likelihood of that is now more considerable. However, I do think that um, there is no sort of single wand that Europe can wave, including this, that will fix the issue of supporting Ukraine adequately against Putin. It requires quite a bit of systemic political realignment on the part of Europeans to do this. Can the EU get rid of Viktor Orban? No. Could appealing to Trump lead to anything positive? I think limitedly with yesterday's meeting, what you can say is that you don't want to generate additional vindictiveness in Trump. That's really it. Trump is a guy who likes being vindictive. He's a guy who does revenge. So what you don't want to do is piss Trump off via surfaces, right? And that's why, actually, when we potentially criticize the way Zelensky handled it, Um, it's open to Kasaki saying Zelensky is a clown. No, Zelensky is not a clown. Um, so um, Zelensky could have gone in all kinds of different directions. So what we're actually assessing is not what he did, but how he handled whatever it was that he was doing. Zelensky could have gone there just appeasing Trump and saying, Mr. Trump, there's no way the war would have happened if you were in power, you say, and you're a very strong leader, so I'm inclined to believe you. We've also got this very special award we give out in Ukraine to global leaders who are doing great things, and we've just decided to give it to you today. So here it is. And when Trump says something unlovely, you absorb it unless you absolutely need to challenge it, and so on. That's one approach. Another approach could have been, now I'm not saying I recommend that remotely, but another approach would have been to go there and systematically but calmly challenge Trump and Vance much stronger than Zelensky did. He could have said, no, it's not me who is risking World War III, it's you by destabilizing major alliances, Mr. Trump. So that would have been an extreme bungee jump that would have only made sense if there was sort of rapid and palpable evidence of European unity and efficacy to pick this up, to pick up support for Ukraine. So you've got to relativize however you assess what happened to Zelensky relative to what he was trying to do. The problem with Zelensky was that he was caught between different things. And his body language was reactive and passive and flat. So he lacked the clarity about what he was doing, and his feeling was, "No, I'm here. This is horrific, and I'm doing boom, boom, boom." His response was, "Ugh, ugh, ugh," you know. And there's a clip going around. I don't know if it's post-truth disinformation of Zelensky swearing at Vance in Russian or Ukrainian. And I've assumed it's just disinformation. But what I'm saying is that if he did actually utter something under the breath, I wouldn't be surprised, given the way he was experiencing the whole thing. Peter, could it be that at one point Zelensky had the impression that he should be humiliated there in a way that he loses domestic support and disappears? You mean that Trump tried to humiliate Zelensky so that Zelensky loses domestic support, which is likely to work the other way? Or do you mean Zelensky tried to humiliate Trump? So I think you're saying that Zelensky may have had the impression that Trump was trying to humiliate him so that he loses domestic support. I think that Zelensky would have rather felt that Trump was trying to humiliate him so as to be well received in the magosphere. That's more likely. Can Putin afford peace? Adam is asking. What are the implications for Russia? When the war stops, the Russian economy collapses, says Ryan Macbeth. And Ryan is one of the most beautiful explainers on YouTube, and I'm extremely proud of him for being both such a prolific cigar smoker and such a fantastic explainer. No is the answer to that. So the Russian economy has got very significant systemic issues. Um, but Putin could sustain both carrying on the war into 2026, and he could sustain stopping the war tomorrow. Now, he'd still keep the militarization of the economy going in many ways. So I suppose in answer to your question, um, we could say to ourselves, well, what is it that would be the biggest challenge for Putin if the war stops? And it's not the economy. If the war stops, the single biggest challenge to Putin is repoliticization in Russia in two ways. Less importantly, it'll be the Z radical constituency that will be after Putin because they want victory, not a peace deal. And actually, I was about to record a video yesterday, just a chat about Glenn Greenwald's interview with Dugin, in which Dugin says, if Putin does a weak deal, I'm going to criticize him publicly. So Putin will be getting blowback from that small demographic in Russia who are fervently pro-victory. But more importantly, he is going to be getting a domestic politicization. He's going to be getting a diffusion of intra-elite conflict, which he progressively cannot control, and that'll have a destabilizing effect on his regime. And I do think that the economic threat is there with carrying on the war, without carrying on the war. But I do think that this is more urgent and more urgently present in Putin's mind. At the same time, Putin's also worried the other way. He is stuck between a rock and a hard place because Putin is obsessed with polls. And he looks at polls all the time. And in many ways, the polls are fake. They just reproduce the notion that the country supports him, even if it doesn't. But there are details there that are correct, different trends up and down that he can observe. And he is now observing a consensus of war fatigue that's almost as significant as the Crimean consensus he had in 2014. And he's worried about that, I bet. And he knows that that's not sustainable. That something needs to be done. So he's also worried, quite frankly, about carrying on the war from the point of view of regime stability. He would need to take a few more totalitarian turns at home to carry on the war for quite a while longer, and may well need to do the same if he stops the war. And there's a risk of doing too little that way and doing too much. So these are things that he is absolutely concerned about. He does take the economic crisis that's looming seriously, but he thinks that whatever its worst impacts, he will be able to politically repress his regime through whatever economic challenges the country faces. So I think that Putin is very, very intensely concentrated on this question of how far his regime is destabilized by carrying on the war, how far his regime is destabilized by stopping the war. And he's genuinely concerned about both scenarios. He's not in a very pretty situation. And that's why I'm sort of sympathetic to Mark Galeotti's assessment that both Russia and Ukraine are losing the war, but Ukraine is losing it faster. Guna is asking, the Baltics have a fear that Europe will abandon us in the face of threats, and that is a real concern. And there is nothing sort of banal and reassuring that I can immediately say, except that obviously Putin's not going to invade the Baltics tomorrow. But If we take a 5 or 10 year look ahead, then the Baltics are unlikely to have Article 5 protection in the near future. The Baltics are, as of today, indeed, not really protected by Article 5, in my judgment, but neither are East European countries. Um, so this is difficult. And in the end, I don't think that there will be a security arrangement for Europe that effectively protects itself from Russia. That Europe's security will, in the end, be dependent on some transformation in Russia too. I don't see the capacity to make Europe, all of Europe entirely safe from Russia for the years to come. But what I wouldn't sort of catastrophize about is some idea of full-scale Russian invasions of other countries. I think what the Russians would do potentially is at some point challenge Article 5 at the lowest possible threshold of challenge. That's not like a full-scale invasion. Um, so, yeah, this is very, very difficult. And it goes to the core of a divide between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, whereby in Western Europe, we just don't feel that this is existential for us. Um, in the sense that our politics is not suited to treating the Russian threat as an existential threat. We just treat it as a threat, but not an existential one. And, you know, certain East European countries, some Scandinavian countries have a sharper focus on the existential nature of the threat, and we don't have that. So that's important to think about. I think what in the end you're probably going to need is supplementary security infrastructure, uh, supplementary to NATO or post NATO in the couple of decades to come. I don't think that the current infrastructure we have will be able to 100% guarantee the security of the Baltic states. Flapjack, do you see Trump's unmasking of American foreign policy motives leading to people realizing we have a long history of being the baddies around the world, countless CIA-backed coups and assassinations? So, um, I'm not sure whether to make that connection really, because yes, it's true. The United States did a lot of unlovely things and also a lot of really terribly destructive, dumb things, like the Iraq War. And recently, the United States backed um, a needless destruction of tens of thousands of lives in Gaza by a state that was carrying out this destruction without a strategy of why it was doing it and what it wanted the consequence of that to be. That has been enormously delegitimizing. But the basic choice is, do you want a United States that is committed to its alliance structures post World War II in a terribly hypocritical way? Or do you want a United States that's not committed to that? And the answer is that the United States is very well committed to these alliance structures, is the United States that will make the world safer. So if you like, this kind of unmasking and sort of breaking through hypocritical veils doesn't lead to a better world. There's often a tendency to say, well, you're doing this good thing, but then you're doing this horrendous thing. So why don't you wake up and shake up the way you're doing this? Well, the shake up could actually lead to just the bad thing being done without the good thing. So I think that's in the end the problem. I tend to think that there are a lot of global challenges that can't be met without the projection of imperial power by the United States. And so we're going to have a lot of global challenges as a result that just go unmet. Can Zelensky get any security guarantees out of Trump? David is asking. Or is there any point in him trying to get an agreement with the US rather than with the European governments? The answer is very probably no, but not an absolute no. But what it would probably need would be Europe to be extremely proactive and look like it's on course to being ready to, implement some troop placement. And then it could be that the United States gets asked about having some kind of very, very limited backstop around that, or providing something to prop that up. I don't know, intelligence or whatever else. Some stuff that is required for the European systems to work and so on. Well, that would be the structure of the thing. It would need to be Europe being very, very compellingly efficacious, and looking like it could do most of the work around the security guarantee, and then there would be a more minor ask of the US around that to make the security guarantee mostly delivered by the Europeans workable in a way that requires some necessary US components. So that would be the way I'd see that. But that's optimistic. How does Glenn Greenwald go from being a critic of mass surveillance and such authoritarian actions to being an apologist of populist authoritarianism, the dangers of contrarianism? I would say, to a large extent, um, there's an element of contrarianism, but there is also an element that's even more important of what I call algorithmic drift. And you could see that happening with Glenn. You saw that happening a little bit with the wonderfully talented Matt Taibbi. So there is a risk of that kind of drift. And there's also then another risk, which is that you're opposed very much to certain things. And because of your opposition to them, you end up supporting a political project that's not constructive. I mean, there's plenty of people for anti-woke reasons are supporting Trump. Um, so, we've got a colleague here on YouTube, Konstantin Kisin, for instance, endorsed Trump, whereas I'm a critic of hyper-identity politics, but that has no connection for me with supporting a post-truth, anti-democratic, authoritarian populist, right? No responsible public intellectual, I'm afraid to say, is going to endorse Trump. I'm going to take that back if you really push me, and I could imagine some circumstances, but they would be very, very weird and nuanced. So I think that there's also this idea you're fighting against certain things, and you just get committed to projects that are meant to deliver that, even though the projects are destructive. So that's often the way this happens. But you should not get from critique of technocratic centrist Democrat politics in the United States to Trump. I'm extremely critical of, if you like, what the political I happen to like Kamala Harris, but in political terms, what the Kamala Harris project stood for, I'm extremely critical of it. In many ways, it's the cause of Trumpism, but that does not make me then recommend US members of the beautiful community to consider voting for Trump. Just like diagnosing one disease that you might have is not going to make me encourage you to get an even worse disease. But that's commonly what happens, right? We get treatments for disease A via disease B that's worse than disease A. Hello, dear Roz. Thank you so much. Thank you for keeping me sane these few months. I bet I haven't done that, but I do try a little bit. Do you think there is any future in a new European security arrangement outside of NATO and the US? So, in principle, yes. In practice, this needs to be worked on. Um, Fundamentally, what will decide whether it's possible is the strength of European democracies. So, if France, Germany, UK, major European powers manage to avoid electing their Trumps in the next election cycle or the one after, then there's more of a prospect of that. But it requires much more confidence that we have in Europe politically, and it requires much more capacity for collective agency. And the problem you've got is that if you look at almost any major centrist politician in Europe, in a big country at least, a lot of their experience is like this. Oh, let's just hold on. Let's just play defense and hold on. So it's a profound, and funnily enough, it's not just politics; it's other institutions, right? Media institutions that are also playing like this role. They're just playing defense, hoping to survive. So, we've got a Labour government in the UK with a huge majority in Parliament, but it's already holding on for dear life because it's feeling like it's just assaulted left, right, and centre by a very hostile political environment. You could blame the government itself for much of that, but not for all of it. So you can't have sort of proactive, regional security developments without a modicum of elbow room in the domestic affairs of these countries. I think that's what will be a crucial detail here. And one of the things that's really worrying is that we've got Europeans sitting around saying, oh, what a calamity they are having there in Washington, whereas we are perhaps an election cycle or two away from having our Trumps. A party that's polling nearly top in the UK is Reform. Nigel Farage, Trump's mate, right? That could be conceivably the next government in the UK in a few years' time. So that if that happens, then no chance at all. No chance at all. And it will be the Russians and the Chinese having a big influence over security arrangements in Eastern Europe. But if we avoid that, then we can. And that's why, funnily enough, the biggest thing Europe can do to be stronger on the foreign stage over the next 2 or 3 years is to address its crisis of legitimacy that it has domestically, whereby there's this very big alienation between voters and their governments. I mean, that's just the beginning of the conversation, but that's sort of my sense. Gaming Gimp. Hello, Gaming Gimp. Vlad, as a guy with a lot of health issues myself, I look up to you and as what I want to be someday. Thank you for all you do. Yeah, I mean, it's about walking forward even when you don't see how you can, right? So a lot of people with significant health issues are doing, in terms of bodily constitution, what Zelensky is doing in politics. Emp is saying, my impression of Zelensky was not just unprepared, but is also tired. Yeah, of course, he's exhausted. It's been 3 years of handling enormous weight, and he's just human. Yeah, I mean, he is sleep deprived and depleted, of course. Vlad, do you think now would be a good time for Europe to convert frozen Russian assets into weapons and material? So some of the issue here is about setting a precedent when we do this, and some of the details are beyond my remit of expertise. So what I would say is that I'm tendentiously favorable to that, but I'm open to being persuaded that it's actually more complicated than I think, because I'm a political philosopher. I'm not an expert in this stuff at all. So my default position is to favor it, but I'm open to being challenged. Gabby is saying, do I think the king will try and pressure Zelensky to resign? Which king? Our king? No. Um, Zelensky is here today in the UK. No. I mean, there is a project to get Zelensky out that unfortunately Putin and Trump are both in on, for different reasons. They both feel very considerable personal animosity to Zelensky. Putin feels that Zelensky has betrayed him. He doesn't see Zelensky as an enemy, he sees him as a traitor. And Trump has long-standing issues with Zelensky. And so they are running this kind of let's get Zelensky out project. It's not easy for them to get Zelensky out, but they're trying. So that's all I can say about that. I mean, Zelensky is in a very difficult position because he is able to stay afloat, but is not able to coherently swim in any direction. He's not able to articulate a vision for where his country is going. He should have done better with that over the last year or two. But today it's very difficult to do it because he'd be doing it in the context of a complete meltdown of the international arrangements on which he depends. So that's a very difficult position in which to be. Arthur, what are your thoughts on Starmer hesitation to comment on Canada becoming the 51st state? So Starmer was asked, I think, on Fox, what does the king think of President Trump saying that Canada should be the 51st state? And he just said the king doesn't need to comment on politics directly, and if he does, it's up to him. I mean, the basic question is, do Europeans appeal and appease Trump, or do they tell him to go screw himself? The way I try to balance that is by saying the more genuine prospect there is of Europeans being able to engage in, effective collective political action, the more plausible it is to tell Trump to go screw himself. The less they're able to do that, the more realistic it is that they're just going to have to suck up to him because they have no alternative. So that's how I'd weigh it. I mean, you could certainly paint a somewhat idealized case for telling Trump to go screw himself, because here is this guy who's coming at you with extortion and a breakage of the old structures that used to run well, and demoting you, disregarding historical alliances. So it's tempting to tell him to go screw himself. A lot of them are doing that in private, but to do it in public, you would need to have a kind of confidence in European collective agency that might be too optimistic. Peter, thank you. Jason Strater, thank you. Vlad, do you think it would have been a more productive conversation if Elon... No. 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 It would have been a disaster if Elon Musk were there. Rubio, yes. But you saw Rubio's situation. I mean, Rubio was the paradigmatic example of a political entrepreneur who got onto a project that violates his values just to get more access to power and to have a prospect of having potentially even presidential power in the future. He did that. He jumped on, and just look at how he was sitting there, right? I mean, he thought he thought that was appalling, and then he needed to put out a tweet saying how great the president was in the meeting. That's not what Rubio thought. He's lying when he says that. He found that quite appalling. Um, but that's what happens when you're a political entrepreneur, riding, for self-advantage. What do you think of the right-wing Silicon Valley? Joseph is asking anti-democracy movements following Curtis Yarvin that Vance seems to represent. Seems like they want to destroy the alliance and US. Well, they want to destroy US bureaucracy and civil service too. I think that you should not underestimate how ideological some of the people in Trump's administration who aren't Trump are. Very ideological. What's the ideology? It's an infantile ideology. I mean, Curtis Yarvin's political views are infantile. They want to take the politics out of politics. A lot of the techno-utopian stuff is based on a kind of scientism and a kind of neoliberalism. The scientism says that you can take an idea of efficiency and run a government on the basis of it, as though efficiency weren't itself one value that needed to be complemented by other values, that itself needed to be filled out in terms of other values. So there's a kind of a scientific idea that you can arrive at some impartial idea of efficiency, which is in fact a way of evacuating politics of all of its substance. And then there is a neoliberal idea that's also scientific, that you can basically run a government like you can run a corporation, like you can run a company. So these are depoliticized, scientific, techno-utopian, neoliberal ideas that are actually parasitic upon the sustenance of institutions. And right now, that kind of ideological wash is doing systemic violence to some of the counter-majoritarian institutions in the United States, and particularly the civil service. So we have a project of institutional dismantlement going on right now, backed up by some of these ideas. And so the emphasis I would make here is, do not underestimate how ideological this is. There's a great tendencies for a lot of Leninist projects. And by Leninist, I simply mean something that a vanguard is executing. Um, um, to say we're not ideological. Maggie Thatcher used to think she wasn't ideological. She was profoundly ideological. So worry about that. Watch it. Count how many compartments of the Titanic are filled with water, so that you're not close to sinking. And reflect on the ideas there, um, that are driving this stuff. Mike Brock wrote a very interesting piece recently, raising the alarm about this, and I think it's important. It's time to start ideologically engaging with the enterprise of this, with the enterprise of this project. We'll be talking about it more for sure. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much, Dan Konu. Twill Kickers, what do you say to those who feel Zelensky responded appropriately during the conversation? It's okay. I mean, but if I don't do any political strategy, consulting. Um, I do a very small amount of consulting, but I don't consult active politicians. I'd be happy to consult an ex-politician. Um, um, I would say there are certain things that were the whole performance from Zelensky was amateur hour, right? As somebody who studies politics, it was really amateur hour, and I called it provincial in the video yesterday. It was just from all points of view badly thought out. Um, Even the act of the pictures being shown to Trump, it's palpable that that's not going to have an effect on Trump. It's going to trigger Trump, and he was bored slash angry when Zelensky was showing him, "Or look at what our troops are doing." Trump interpreted that as offensive, condescending, teacherly, and nobody could see the pictures anyway. So don't do that. And then choose the level of firmness with which you're going to put these guys in their place, but don't speak over them. For goodness sake, let them finish and then speak. Um, Second, third, obviously, I would have told them to speak Ukrainian when things were getting edgy. Um, Zelensky is a wordsmith. Zelensky is a young politician. He only started politics, half a decade ago. Bit more than that, but just a few years. Um, and he is used to casually talking in public. He's used to back and forth and so on. And so another problem was that his English couldn't carry the level of back and forth he tried to engage in with Vance and Trump. So that was again counterproductive. So, if there was like a timeout and I was advising him, I would say, if you're getting activated to a level of 5 out of 10 or more, immediately convert to Ukrainian. Um, we can strategize how firmly you put these guys in their place. Don't speak at the same time as they speak. And don't be petulant and defensive, right? So your cards are weak. I'm not playing cards. Yes, you are. You're playing cards. You're playing with people's lives. No, I'm not playing cards. You can respond to that very, very strongly, but without that kind of impulsive back and forth. So, so just from any point of view, this wasn't done. This wasn't done well, and even if the Zelensky team decided they needed to emphasize how much Putin was a killer, they could have done that differently too. So, so it's fundamentally really about having some kind of tactical approach to that 45-minute period, being prepared about what's going to come your way, not going like this when it happens, right? Vance has been a little shit about Ukraine for weeks, right? So you know what's risky there. You also know what Vance did in Munich. He did a performance for a domestic audience at a security conference in Europe. So you can anticipate all of that. You can also anticipate that Trump's going to get progressively triggered by saying negative things about Putin. So don't say them or say them and then plan for Trump being triggered. So there's plenty that could have been done differently. And that's even compatible with Zelensky challenging these guys more, not less. But fundamentally, what I think should have probably been avoided is a generation of additional vindictiveness in Trump in exchange for no substance, right? You piss Trump off only if you're gaining something strategically for Ukraine from that, tactically, for Ukraine from that. If you're not, don't do it, right? So he could have owned these guys pretty well if he were prepped By the time we got to whatever minute 38, minute 39, when it was escalating, um, so you can paint any picture of what the approach was. My suggestion is there wasn't a clear enough approach, and there wasn't a clear enough preparation of what was gonna come his way, and that's why you saw uh, Ukrainian ambassador uh, who is experienced and is on top of the potential deals that were going to be made. She was sitting like this. She wasn't comfortable with how this was devolving. Do I listen to Bruckner? Yes, but I want to comment on your question more on the classical music channel. Sorry. Um, I go subscribe there, and I promise I will be taking a lot of questions there. I just want my health to be a little bit more stable. We'll kick off that channel. What do I think about how Zelensky's performance was perceived? I think positively more than negatively in Ukraine. But we also want to say that there are Ukrainians who didn't like it, and there are Ukrainians who feel that Zelensky hasn't been communicating with them coherently about what the hell is happening to the country and where it's going over the last year or two. So it's both. What you don't want to do is confuse a majority with a minority of Ukrainians. But what you also don't want to do is confuse statements all Ukrainians think with reality. Um, you know, Ukrainian public is complex and intelligent and diverse. So we have to allow for that. Anna, Russia and Belarus are going to conduct a military exercise. As far as I understand, we mentioned Ryan Macbeth recently. He'd be perfectly good at answering that. Jake Bro would be too. My sense is that this is routine, so therefore the answer is no chance at all that this will be an attack on other countries. Russia and Belarus are going to conduct the military exercise in 2025. Yeah, no, this is not going to be an attack on other countries. Mrs. Mittens, how do you deal with what would be a catastrophic defeat for the West if Russia is allowed to triumph? I've always loved America and its values. I feel the world is crumbling and I'm starting to feel nihilistic. So don't feel nihilistic because, no, I'm sorry. If you feel nihilistic, you just start with how you feel. But what I want to say is any situation that you're in politically can always be made better or worse by 1%. And that affects real lives, right? So whatever happens, whether there is a deal or there isn't a deal, um, whether they get a cessation of hostilities or they don't, um, the outcomes are always matters of degree, better or worse. And that makes a big difference, right? Just like with the extent of Russia's invasion, it makes a big difference, you know, how many Ukrainians are stuck under Russian occupation. You know, this is everything we do is a matter of degree. How far our institutions degrade is a matter of degree. How well we're dealing with the climate crisis is a matter of degree, right? We're dealing pretty badly, but it's a matter of degree. And with the climate, for instance, every fraction of a degree matters enormously to how many people are going to have their lives just disrupted or lose their lives, or how many, climate probabilified waves of war, migration we're going to have, and so on. So I think that's one thing. The second thing to say is that, we're at the beginning of an historical transition. And this raises issues of acceptance, because it's strange that things that we're used to relying on are melting away a little bit. So that creates a problem of accepting things, and also balancing acceptance with inability to accept, or acceptance with refusal to accept. So this is a difficult transitional period. If you're feeling nihilistic and you're even feeling very profoundly physiologically impacted, understand that that's a kind of normal when the world's changing very fast and in a somewhat scary way, in a way that feels both bad and a bit unintelligible. And it normally takes, as I like to say repeatedly these days, sort of 18 to 24 months to get to a stage where you're a little bit calmer in response to what's happening. Um, I think the bottom line is always, can you tell an honest, not overly optimistic picture about the future that doesn't cause despair? And I'm firmly of the belief that you can right now tell that picture about the future of many human beings on Earth, in particular Western citizens. We also have to not succumb to a certain kind of indulgence, right? That if we go from being in a relatively good predicament here in the West in 2005, let's say, to a situation where things are getting worse, our polities are getting more toxic. We have less solidarity in our societies, our foreign policy is melting down a bit. We'll still be in a remarkably privileged predicament, folks in the West in 2040, let's say, to the overwhelming majority of human beings who ever existed. We will be worse in some ways than in 2005 in 2040, but we'll still be in a much more privileged position than the vast majority of humans who ever existed. And that's important too, that kind of scale, that kind of sense of what, generations that came before you went through and what people right now in the world are going through. I mean, one of the biggest challenges, the single biggest challenge that Western democracies face is losing the democracy and becoming Hungary. And that's terrible. It's really terrible. Um, but just imagine you're in Hungary today. You can go listen to the Budapest Festival Orchestra under Ivan Fischer. You can go have a beautiful meal. You can't easily kick your government out. That's pretty tragic. And you've got a muzzling of counter-majoritarian institutions, from the academy to the courts, but to the media. That's bad, but it's a level of bad that's a few degrees removed from where we are today, in countries that do have their democracy, but not a million degrees removed, right? It's not like you're sitting underground in a dungeon. Um, so we also have that kind of perspective too. Um, but I know it's hard because it's just inconceivable that we might be facing a risk of losing our democracies. Um, and then I'll just say that most of you will probably have your democracy by 2040. That's a reasonable gamble. Some of us will lose the democracy we have. Some of us will keep it. So, um, sorry if that's too tough. I'll give a softer answer another time too. Um, if you want consulting information, you can just look up uh, look it up under any email or on my website. But the way to do it is just to email me at get in touch with Vlad at outlook.com. I do a very small amount because of my health and my commitment to the community. Um, but I do a very small amount. It's very expensive, and I do it a couple of hours a month, often that little. And I'd want to receive a 2 or 3 minute summary of what challenge you're looking for help with, whether it be political or more generally self-development. And if there is a fit, we can go ahead. Um, so that's the way to do that, but it's an absolutely tiny amount of windows. I almost do none. Um, but I absolutely encourage you to get in touch if you would like. about that. I see no alternative in the end, Luke is saying, than military conflict with Russia unless European democracies fall or something else. Guess what are your thoughts? My thought is still that military conflict with Russia is possible, but on balance, unlikely. Partly because there's plenty of unpredictable events that could happen inside Russia, partly because history is limitlessly unpredictable. And even if you're on a trend towards something, like on the trend toward Russia challenging Article 5, you could float past it for reasons of contingent historical events. And um, because our alliances could melt down so much, Russia will not see us as an enemy. That's a worry, but that's also a problem about where we might be heading. Ruta said that Zelensky should apologize. Now, I don't know about this. Do you think he said that to not further avoid Trump and buy himself time to manage the situation? I haven't seen that. Now, I don't think that Zelensky did anything wrong as such. He just didn't handle the situation well. Um, it's I think it's Vance who misbehaved, um, but uh, Zelensky may well need to reflect on doing that. Absolutely, because of Ukraine's profound dependence on the United States. Um, so I don't have more to say about this than that. Um, it was an ethical failure what Vance and Trump did, not on their own terms, because all they do is just fail ethically. Whereas what Zelensky did wasn't an ethical failure. He was bad at handling people who were failing ethically. You could then argue that in high politics, failing to handle people who are misbehaving can itself be a moral failure if you have a country, on your back that's vulnerable in relation to every word you utter and every action you take. Sure, you could make the case that it's a moral failure by Zelensky in that way, but it's not a moral failure through him misbehaving. It's a moral failure through him handling badly people who are being, um, you know, absolutely foul toward him. So that's the sort of ethical way up of it. Politically, I don't have more to say. I don't have more to say at the moment. But he may well need to reflect on apologizing. That could be one of the eventualities, and it may need it. He may be open to some kind of fudged apology. The problem is that it's now hard to see how you can reestablish a decent ongoing relationship between Trump and Zelensky after this happened. So, but it's time to be skeptical about that. The B Knight is saying, these are the times where you look in the mirror and ask, "What are you doing?" And one day someone will you ask you what your answer was and what you did. Um, yeah, okay, but you've got to also then be generous and sort of take that personally too. Um, right? So one thing you can do is just talk to people in your life constructively about what's going on. D is saying, Vlad, in Hungary, corruption is eating up people's quality of life, just like in Russia and China. An enlightened dictatorship sounds fine, but it always ends up in major corruption. Yeah, but I mean, th these are removes away from each other, right? It's just a matter of that distance, right? It's really bad in Hungary, but it's obviously nothing like Belarus. You're not going to be taken away in the middle of the night for saying the wrong thing. Um, so that's what I was really saying in the context of what it means to lose your democracy, right? Losing your democracy is not like ending up in Belarus necessarily. It's just your counter majoritarian institutions grinding down. Phillips is saying, isn't it good that Zelensky stood up to the ambush instead of eating shit while smiling? The deal was only good for USA and was denied. Isn't this a signal to MAGA that post-truth bullying doesn't work? Well, Zelensky could have been more submissive or more recalcitrant and firmer with them. But what I'm saying is he needed to have handled both better. So I'm agnostic about what approach he was taking. So I'm not against him standing up less than he did or more than he did. But in other words, if is what he did effectively stand up to them? No, I don't think so. I don't think he handled that well. So if you wanted him to stand up, he would go back to the conversation we had a quarter of an hour ago or so, where we talked about what he would have done, um, you know, differently in the way he handled himself, in the way he communicated, in the way he managed his impulses. Um, so no, it wasn't impressive. His body language wasn't impressive. Um, so do it better with more preparation, take more control, look more authoritative, make better decisions about when to challenge, how to challenge, which language to speak, right? Um, so he floated through the thing a bit and was sort of hit by the crisis that developed in minute 38. That's the issue, not that he should have been more passive or more proactive in challenging them. Are Europeans trapped in US propaganda? I'm not sure what that means. Certainly, it's only sort of post-authoritarian parties in Europe that are Trump filled with Trump propaganda. Is there any future for the EU as an institution? Yes, there's a long future for the EU as an institution, but it'll get progressively weaker and less functional. It'll be sort of melting down from inside rather than collapsing. It's not heading for collapse. Do you think this transition is new? I personally see these trends as cyclical. Hyper neoliberalism is just lawlessness. You have no rights. No, it's not just lawlessness. It's an ideology. That's very important. It's not just lawlessness. Um, it's a conception of how political life works that's quite compelling, and has many features about it, has many assumptions about human nature and many ideas of what a good society looks like and what it doesn't look like, and so on. So um, I think the answer to what you're saying is actually probably yes, but these cycles are not regular. In many ways, we're having things washed away that have been established for decades, since the Second World War. So it's cyclical, but the cycles are long. The problem is Russia won the information war. We let them win. They own X and the richest man in the world. Um, they even get to decide who the leader of the free world is. Congratulations. No, they haven't decided. Americans decided who their president is. And I'm not sure the Russians won. I mean, look at the UK. We are more proactive than some European countries. Our prime minister has talked about potentially British troops on the ground in Ukraine, but with a US backstop, a very ephemeral US backstop. So we are, in many ways, not very proactive. We are in many ways in a situation where we've abandoned seriousness about our defense needs. Um, um, but that's not because people are buying Putin's propaganda in the UK. Um, I mean, recent polls suggest that something like 2% in the UK think that Putin is on the right side in this war. And if I'm wrong about that, it's something like 8%, but it's probably more like 2%. So um, we are not very interested in the Ukraine issue in the UK. It's not in the top 5 or 7 political issues, but we're not pro Putin. We tend to think that Ukraine got brutally invaded. Over 90% of us think that. So I don't think that you can connect, uh, for instance, a picture of the incapacity of the UK to act with some account of how we've all got persuaded of Russian propaganda. We haven't. We take we're very divided, certainly about um, Gaza, right? Probably um, 2/3 of Brits think that what happened is outrageous, and a third think it's okay. Um, but Israel's response to the barbarism of October 7th. Um, so that's a kind of divide, but we're not divided on Ukraine. Um, now, what you should also be concerned about is not confusing sort of domestic post-truth discourse with Russian propaganda. It's important to not equate it with that, unless there's clear evidence why, in a particular case, you should make that equation. Okay, let's jump into the general comments for a bit. Trump seems genuinely scared of World War III. Um, I think he is not clear that Ukraine is important to even minorly increase the risk of World War III over. I think that's really more his position. It's not that he's scared of World War III, it's that he doesn't think Ukraine is important. Let's have a look. Deepa Dabby, thank you. Rachel is asking, what do I think of Greg Palast's report about the US election? I don't know. Is that the idea that Trump didn't win? If that's the idea, I think it's a politically really, really bad direction in which to push. What's the US goal? Mick is asking. Well, some of the US goals are a sphere of influence, politics, a weak EU, um, support of some of this global wave of authoritarian populism. I mean, what Trump's drawn to is really what I'm talking about. Um, but I think overall, if you were to capture it, it would be something like a, a politics of spheres of influence with this hyperliberal emphasis of interests, not values, and buy it, uh, extort it, and not yet, but possibly later conquer it too. So I think that's the texture of the politics. Um, and the best way in terms of international affairs to cast it is really a politics of spheres of influence that has parallels with some historical periods in the past, including the 19th century. Trump seems genuinely scared of Putin. Not sure he's genuinely scared. He's genuinely um, submissive with Putin because Putin um, is such a significant source of narcissistic supply for Trump that elevating Putin does a lot for Trump's grandiosity. Elevating Putin and aligning himself next to Putin does a lot for Trump's grandiosity. And so there's going to be a main channel video on exactly how I think that works, why Trump is submissive to Putin because he is not well with his narcissism. And that's why it's a very, very significant sort of loss for Trump if he loses that. So part of the interesting thing about Trump's reaction to Zelensky uh, calling Putin a killer isn't just what's been reported that Trump wants to make a deal, and so he doesn't think that uh, being in a dynamic where Putin's publicly called bad names is good because he's already talking to Putin in various direct and indirect ways. But it's also the case that and you could feel it physically, right? It's like a little bit of a physical jab at Trump when Putin is seriously criticized or insulted, because Trump is very dependent on Putin as an object that generates a lot of his narcissistic supply, which roughly works along the lines of elevating Putin and then aligning himself with him. And that's a long established dynamic he's had with Putin. And I think that's the nature of the narcissistic submissiveness that's going on. Narcissists don't always put themselves first. If it, uh, you know, fulfills their self-regulation, they will often put themselves in a submissive second place, happily. Um, and that's what's going on with Trump. It's not that the Russians have something on him. It's that there's some alignment in values or lack of values, and then there is this sort of narcissistic submission. I'd be very worried about the fracture in the alliance, right? But I wouldn't be literally worried about Trump annexing Canada by